You're standing in the shadow of the Parthenon, surrounded by marble columns that have witnessed centuries of human triumph and suffering. The morning sun casts golden light across the ancient stones, and tourists snap photos of what they believe represents the pinnacle of civilization. But what they don't see, what the guidebooks don't tell them, is the dark reality that existed behind these magnificent facades. While we celebrate ancient Greece for democracy, philosophy, and artistic achievement, we rarely speak of those who paid the ultimate price to maintain this splendor. Young men forced into lives of servitude as male concubines to the wealthy and powerful. These weren't just servants performing household duties or slaves working in the fields. They were human beings trapped in a system designed to exploit their youth, beauty, and vulnerability for the pleasure of Greece's elite. Their stories reveal a side of ancient Greek civilization that challenges our romanticized view of this foundational culture, exposing the brutal reality of what it meant to be powerless in a world where social status determined everything. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Then please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together, from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The institution of male concubinage in ancient Greece was vastly different from our modern understanding of relationships, where we recognize clear boundaries between consent and coercion. Greeks operated within a complex social hierarchy where power determined everything, and at the bottom of this hierarchy were young men who found themselves thrust into roles they never chose. These young men, often barely past childhood, were selected not for their skills or intelligence, but for their physical appearance and perceived ability to provide companionship for their masters. The selection process itself was dehumanizing beyond imagination. Wealthy Greek citizens would visit slave markets, much like modern people might visit livestock auctions, examining potential purchases for their physical attributes, age and origin. Young men from conquered territories were particularly sought after, with those from Thrace valued for their fair complexions and those from Asia Minor prized for their supposed refinement. The buyers showed no consideration for the terror these young men must have felt, standing exposed and vulnerable, while strangers debated their worth as if they were objects rather than human beings. Once purchased, these concubines entered households where their lives were no longer their own. They were expected to be available at all hours, to anticipate their master's needs before being asked, and to maintain an appearance of willing participation regardless of their true feelings. The psychological toll of this existence cannot be overstated. Imagine being forced to smile and appear grateful while enduring treatment that violated every aspect of your dignity and autonomy. The daily routine of a male concubine varied dramatically depending on their master's preferences and social status. Some were kept in luxurious quarters, dressed in fine chitons, and given access to education and cultural activities, always with the understanding that these privileges came at a price that would be collected whenever their master desired. Others lived in conditions barely better than common slaves, called upon only when their master wanted their company, then dismissed back to quarters where they had no privacy, no personal possessions, and no hope of escape. What made their situation particularly tragic was the complete lack of legal protection or recourse available to them. While Greek law provided certain protections for citizens, and even some rights for regular slaves, male concubines occupied a grey area where their master's desires took precedence over any consideration of their well-being. They couldn't seek help from authorities, couldn't form meaningful relationships with others, and couldn't even express their suffering without risking severe punishment. The psychological manipulation these young men endured was perhaps even more damaging than the physical aspects of their servitude. Masters often employed techniques designed to break down their resistance and create emotional dependency. Some concubines were given special privileges or shown temporary kindness, only to have these gifts withdrawn as punishment for perceived slights. This created a constant state of anxiety and confusion, as they never knew whether they were in favour or facing punishment for some imagined transgression. Many masters deliberately isolated their concubines from other household members, preventing them from forming friendships or alliances that might provide emotional support. This isolation was particularly cruel for young men torn from their families and communities, as it prevented them from maintaining any connection to their former identities or cultures. They were forced to exist in a liminal space, neither fully slave nor free, neither child nor adult, neither Greek nor foreign, simply property with human form. The competitive nature of some households added another layer of psychological torture. When masters kept multiple concubines, they often pitted them against each other for attention and privileges. This prevented solidarity among the victims and created an atmosphere of constant tension and betrayal. Young men who might have found comfort in shared experiences instead found themselves competing for their master's favour, knowing that falling out of favour could mean even worse treatment or sale to less desirable situations. The education provided to some concubines was itself a form of control masked as generosity. While learning to read, write, and engage in philosophical discussions might seem like opportunities for advancement, these skills were primarily taught to make the concubines more entertaining companions. They were expected to discuss literature and politics in ways that pleased their masters, to recite poetry on command, and to demonstrate their learning as another form of performance for their owner's enjoyment. Physical appearance was maintained through strict regimens that concubines had no choice but to follow. They were required to exercise regularly, maintain specific diets, and undergo grooming practices that kept them looking youthful and attractive. Some were even subjected to cosmetic treatments or minor surgeries to alter their appearance according to their master's preferences. These procedures were performed without modern medical knowledge or pain management, making them both dangerous and excruciating. The clothing and jewellery worn by concubines served as both ornaments and symbols of ownership. Masters often took pride in how beautifully they could dress their companions, treating them like living dolls rather than human beings. The irony was profound. While draped in silk and adorned with gold, they remained utterly powerless beneath these beautiful trappings. Every garment was chosen by someone else, every ornament placed by another's hand, every aspect of their appearance controlled by their master's taste. Travel presented another aspect of their lives that might seem privileged, but was actually another form of control. Some concubines accompanied their masters on journeys to other city-states or to country estates, but this travel was never voluntary. They were essentially portable property, expected to provide the same services regardless of location, while adapting to new environments and social situations without complaint. The change of scenery did nothing to change their fundamental lack of freedom. The social dynamics within Greek households created additional challenges for male concubines. While they might live in relative luxury compared to field slaves, they had no real status within the household hierarchy. Other slaves might look down on them, seeing their role as shameful, while free members of the household treated them as temporary diversions rather than people worthy of respect or consideration. They existed in a social vacuum, belonging nowhere and accepted by no one. The impact on families left behind cannot be overlooked in understanding the full scope of this tragedy. When young men were taken as concubines, their families often never learned what had become of them. Parents might spend years wondering whether their sons were alive or dead, never knowing they were trapped in situations from which escape was nearly impossible. This separation was particularly cruel in cultures where family bonds were sacred and community support was essential for survival. Some concubines were acquired through debt slavery, where families facing financial ruin were forced to give up their sons to pay creditors. These families faced the impossible choice between watching all their children starve or sacrificing one son to save the rest. The psychological burden on both the families and the young men involved was devastating, as everyone understood the true nature of the sacrifice being made. The few records that exist of concubines attempting to escape paint a picture of desperate young men driven to take enormous risks for even the slimmest chance of freedom. The punishments for failed escape attempts were severe and public, designed to discourage others from trying. These punishments often involved not just physical pain, but public humiliation, as masters wanted to demonstrate their complete control over their property while sending a clear message to other potential runaways. Some concubines tried to end their suffering through suicide, but even this final escape was often denied to them. Masters who had invested significant sums in purchasing and maintaining their concubines took measures to prevent this loss of property, including constant supervision and the removal of objects that could be used for self-harm. The tragic irony was that even death required permission from someone else. The religious aspect of Greek society provided little comfort to these young men. While Greeks worshipped gods associated with justice and protection, these divine protections apparently did not extend to male concubines. Some found solace in mystery cults or foreign religions, but even these spiritual practices had to be conducted in secret, as masters often controlled every aspect of their concubines' lives, including their religious beliefs and practices. The economic value placed on concubines created a thriving market that encouraged the continued capture and sale of young men. Wealthy Greeks competed with each other to acquire the most beautiful or talented companions, driving up prices and creating incentives for traders to continue supplying this market. The commodification of human beings reached disturbing levels in these transactions, where young men's lives were reduced to simple monetary calculations based on their physical attributes and perceived entertainment value. Training schools existed specifically to prepare young men for lives as concubines, much like gymnasia prepared athletes for competition. These institutions were as brutal as they were profitable, systematically breaking down the personalities and resistance of their students while teaching the skills expected by their future masters. The curriculum included not just physical training, but psychological conditioning designed to create compliant, attractive companions who would never question their circumstances. The age at which young men entered this life varied, but many were still children when their fates were sealed. The developmental impact of growing up in such circumstances cannot be overstated. These boys never had the opportunity to form normal relationships, develop their own interests, or even understand what healthy human connections might look like. Their entire understanding of intimacy and companionship was warped by the power dynamics of their servitude. Regional differences in how concubines were treated reflected the diverse cultures within the Greek world, but none of these differences offered true protection or dignity. In Sparta, the emphasis on military discipline created different expectations for male concubines, while in pleasure-loving Corinth, they faced different forms of exploitation. However, regardless of location, the fundamental lack of freedom and autonomy remained constant across all Greek territories. The retirement or aging of concubines presented another cruel aspect of their existence. Unlike other slaves who might eventually earn or buy their freedom, concubines who lost their physical appeal often found themselves discarded with no resources or skills for independent survival. Some masters simply abandoned their aging companions, while others sold them to lower status households, where conditions were invariably worse than what they had previously endured. The rare cases of concubines who managed to gain their freedom and achieve some measure of success later in life stand out precisely because they were so exceptional. These individuals often had to completely reinvent themselves, hiding their past while struggling to overcome the psychological damage of their earlier experiences. Their success stories, while inspiring, also highlight how unusual it was for anyone to escape this system with their humanity intact. Medical care for concubines was provided not out of compassion, but to maintain their value as property. Masters wanted to keep their investments healthy and attractive, so they provided medical attention when necessary. However, this care was limited to maintaining appearance and function, with no consideration for psychological well-being or long-term health consequences. The concubines' bodies were treated like valuable objects that required maintenance rather than human beings deserving of care. The social acceptance of this system among Greek elites reveals much about the moral framework of ancient Greek civilization. While Greeks prided themselves on concepts of honor, virtue, and philosophical wisdom, these ideals apparently only applied to free citizens of appropriate social status. The suffering of concubines was simply considered irrelevant to moral calculations, demonstrating how completely they had been dehumanized in Greek society. Some concubines developed what we might now recognize as survival strategies, learning to read their master's moods, anticipate their desires, and navigate the complex social dynamics of their households. While these skills helped them avoid the worst punishments, they also required them to become expert actors, constantly performing contentment and gratitude while suppressing their true feelings. This psychological split between their public persona and private reality often led to profound identity confusion that lasted long after their servitude ended. The seasonal patterns of Greek social life affected concubines' experiences as well. During major festivals like the Panathenea or Dionysiac celebrations, they might be expected to participate in elaborate entertainments or private parties, while quieter periods offered brief respite from constant attention. However, even these quieter times were marked by anxiety about when they might next be summoned or what new demands might be placed upon them. Communication with other concubines or slaves was often restricted, but when possible, these young men developed their own networks of support and information sharing. They learned to communicate through subtle gestures and coded language, sharing warnings about their master's moods, or offering comfort during particularly difficult times. These connections, while necessarily secretive, provided crucial emotional support in an otherwise isolating existence. The impact of this system extended beyond its immediate victims to influence Greek society as a whole. The normalization of treating human beings as objects for pleasure contributed to a broader culture of exploitation and dehumanization. This cultural acceptance made it easier for Greeks to justify other forms of cruelty and oppression, from the brutal treatment of helots in Sparta to the casual disposal of unwanted infants throughout the Greek world. Archaeological evidence provides glimpses into the lives of these forgotten victims. Artifacts found in wealthy Greek households include objects likely used to control or monitor concubines, as well as personal items that hint at their daily experiences. However, most physical evidence of their existence has been lost to time, just as their voices were silenced in life. The literary references to male concubines in Greek writings are often brief and euphemistic, reflecting the author's desire to acknowledge these relationships without describing their more disturbing aspects. Between the lines of these texts, however, we can read the reality of lives characterized by powerlessness and exploitation. The transition periods when concubines were sold from one master to another were particularly traumatic, as they faced the uncertainty of new households, different expectations, and unknown levels of cruelty or kindness. Each transition meant starting over in terms of learning how to survive in a new environment while maintaining the psychological defenses that had kept them alive in their previous situation. As we reflect on these forgotten stories of suffering and survival, we must remember that behind every historical statistic was a real human being with hopes, fears, and dreams. that were never allowed to flourish. The concubines of ancient Greece were not footnotes to history, but individuals whose experiences reveal important truths about power, exploitation, and human resilience. Their stories challenge us to look beyond the marble facades and golden treasures of ancient Greece to see the human cost of this civilization's grandeur. They remind us that historical progress often came at the expense of the most vulnerable members of society, and that the price of luxury and power was frequently paid by those who had no choice in the matter. The systematic nature of this exploitation demonstrates how easily societies can normalize and institutionalize cruelty when it serves the interests of the powerful. The Greeks' ability to maintain elaborate philosophical and democratic systems while simultaneously operating this network of human trafficking shows how selective moral reasoning can become when it challenges existing power structures. These young men's experiences also illuminate the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Despite facing circumstances designed to break them completely, many found ways to maintain some sense of self and dignity. Their small acts of resistance, moments of connection with others, and determination to survive represent triumphs of humanity over systematic dehumanization. Understanding their stories helps us recognize similar patterns of exploitation and abuse in our own time. While the specific forms may have changed, the underlying dynamics of power, vulnerability, and systematic oppression remain relevant today. Their experiences serve as a warning about what can happen when societies allow the powerful to treat other human beings as objects for their pleasure and profit. In remembering these forgotten voices, we honor their memory and remind ourselves of our obligation to prevent such systematic abuse from occurring again. The concubines of ancient Greece lived and died in circumstances that no human being should ever have to endure. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not as titillating historical curiosities, but as testimonies to human suffering and resilience that continue to echo through the ages, demanding our attention and our commitment to justice.